To discuss the situation in India, we welcome from New Delhi the journalist and co-founder of Roots-in-Kashmir, Sushil Pandit. From New York, Suchitra Vijayan is a lawyer and founding director of the Polis Project and recently has been through India's Assam state. Rana Ayyub is also a journalist and writer. She joins us from Cape Town, South Africa, and with us in our studio, Sadanand Dhume is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sadanand, let me start with you in the studio. As we heard from our reporter, this is an issue that goes back a long way. At its essence, it's about demographics. But to what extent is this also about religion and politics?
It's a very good question, Anand. You know, it started out, the Assam question started out as being one that was more about language than religion per se. So you have the Assamese-speaking people, who over the decades have found tens of millions of Bengali-speaking people, both Hindu and Muslim, entering their state, many of them from Bangladesh. Now, over the years, it has metamorphosed, and the problem we are seeing today, or the way we're seeing the issue framed today, is more in religious terms, because the people who are being viewed most actively as outsiders, and the people who fear that their citizenship may be taken away, are predominantly, though not only, are predominantly Bengali-speaking Muslims, as opposed to Bengali-speaking Hindus.
And that is what is causing the problem right now.
Well, because you have to see this Assam issue along with another there's a piece of legislation that is going through Parliament that may allow people who have emigrated to India from, say, from Bangladesh who are Hindu to get citizenship. So if that happens, then the only people who are sort of left out would be the ones who speak, who are Muslim. Even though, if you just look at the process in Assam itself, you know, the people who have been identified are both Muslim and Hindu. But if this other parallel citizenship bill goes through, then the only people left out may be Muslim.
All right, let's go to Rana Ayyub in Cape Town. Rana, the first draft of that list that was made up had 19 million names on it. And of course, people have appealed. They provided the correct paperwork. Now there are 4 million names on that list. I mean, what are we to make of the fact that 4 million people who've lived in India for the last, 50, 60 years, a generation, 2 generations in some circumstances, as our reporter just pointed out, could become stateless?
Absolutely, Anand. These are people who are staying in Assam for over decades, and the process is very arbitrary. You have the kin of the president or the former president of India who does not find himself in the list. There are army men and their kin who do not find themselves in the list. It's a very arbitrary process. Also, there's no definition of who is a migrant in this case, and what is the solution should these people not find their names in the list. In this very arbitrary process, you have given them a period of a month, but a month is not enough time for a population which is mostly underprivileged, which is not educated, which might not have its legal documents, birth certificates in place. We also have had a flood in the state. So it's a very arbitrary process. Also, as Sadanand was pointing out, this is it's more to do with the government of the day has made it more of a Hindu-Muslim issue, wherein the Hindu migrant, the Hindu Bangladeshi has been labeled a migrant, and the Muslim as an infiltrator. And this is it's also basically the government's project where you are polarizing people before the elections. The government spokespersons have said at various occasions that they will be willing to take the Hindu migrants as a part of the Citizenship Act, but will have issues with the Bengali infiltrators, including the president of the ruling party who has said this in the Indian Parliament. He has called them infiltrators. So it has become more of a communal issue, which has mostly over decades been an ethnic issue.
Sushil Pandit, to Rana's point about this having taken on a religious and ethnic tenor, if you like, do you agree with her that in many instances here we are seeing a government which is ready to accept those who follow the Hindu religion as migrants into this particular state in India, but not those who are Muslim? They're seen, as she pointed out, as infiltrators.
I'm afraid this communalization of the issue is to put the government on the defensive. It was agreed upon by successive prime ministers that Assam is facing a demographic invasion from Bangladesh. and that they are coming here in millions and somehow they need to be stopped, identified, and deported. There was bipartisan consensus on this issue, especially after the fierce agitation of 80s. Assam, and through Assam, several other Indian states now have a huge Bangladeshi illegal immigrant population. Assam is facing the brunt of it because it is at the front line of this porous border and illegal immigration. Supreme Court is supervising this exercise of identifying aliens. Nobody can accuse Supreme Court of having any communal bias.
Right.
It is because successive governments have failed that Supreme Court has stepped in and it is supervising this. The point is, if you communalize the issue, then you obviously put the government, which has to implement the Supreme Court decisions, on the defensive and thwart the entire exercise. As far as the new citizenship bill is concerned, the present government has a view, and quite a few feel that it is quite legitimate view, that a lot of Hindu refugees from West Bengal escape religious persecution. They are being driven out in a case of continuing genocide of decades, and they have nowhere else to go but to come to India. Like in Pakistan or Afghanistan, the dwindling population of non-Muslims in these three countries is alarming. They are disappearing at a fast rate, and India feels responsible to offer them refuge.
All right, thank you. Let me go to Suchitra to look at the legal situation here. Suchitra, what is the legal situation here? Because, you know, on the one hand, we can lay the blame at the door of the government to say that they are acting out of political or religious motivation. On the other hand, they are actually implementing a decision that was taken by the Indian Supreme Court, aren't they?
That is correct. But often what you see over and over again is that we hide behind the farce of legal procedure, the Supreme Court of India. What we forget is that these institutions are manned by people who often have serious prejudice. Now, the stand that's taken by BJP regularly is that this is a Supreme Court of India mandated list, and then it's a Supreme Court that's in charge. But if you actually look at the history of it, first and foremost, the procedure itself is deeply problematic. And second, Assam has a very different citizenship law as against the rest of the country. Section 6A, which is still being, its constitutionality is being challenged, and the Supreme Court of India has not actually answered if this actual section is legal or unconstitutional. Second, many other legal scholars have pointed out that Supreme Court of India's actual mandating of the NRC itself might not be within its ambit, especially given that the Supreme Court actually has directed the government of India to have proper relationships with Bangladesh and actually have relationships to create a solution for this. And this is an ambit of foreign policy making that the Supreme Court really clearly doesn't have. Secondly, at the Polis Project, one of the things that we have been doing is looking at what happens to violence through the justice system. And increasingly what we have found through our data between 2000 and 2018, for which we have information, is that most of the time the judiciary does not prosecute people who have been affected by violence. And majority of the people who are affected by violence happen to be Muslims, Dalits, SCSTs. In this case, what we really see is that hiding behind the language of the law. The second thing that we see over again is that there is a crisis of legality and legal constitutional morality within the country when recently existing Supreme Court judges raised the issue of serious problems within India's Supreme Court. So what I would genuinely urge is to think about the hiding behind the farce of legal language. Let's understand that apartheid was legal, segregation was legal. Many of the laws that are now being implemented throughout the world, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in the United States, whether in India, they all take the language of law, yet sometimes due process and law might not actually mean justice.
Sadanand, India has been a secular democracy since independence, and it's always thrown open the doors to those escaping religious and political persecution. But what's changed now? And to Sushil's point that these are not asylum seekers who are escaping persecution in their home countries. These are people who are economic migrants. They're looking for jobs.
I mean, that's a very good question, and that's really the crux of the issue. In the past, India has taken vast numbers of refugees. In 1971, when the Pakistani army was conducting genocide in Bangladesh, many refugees came across the borders, and in fact, that's the genesis of part of this issue. Some of them were Hindus, some of them were Muslims. India even took in refugees after during the Afghan crisis, albeit not in particularly large numbers. I see this in some ways as a direct consequence of India's warped identity politics. And essentially what we have arrived at today in India, more than 7 decades after independence, is a situation where political parties across the spectrum, and it's not just the BJP, but it's also the Congress and other parties, they appeal to voters essentially on the basis of their identity. And what this means is that in a place like Assam, there is a sense that the Muslims will never vote for the BJP, and that the others, mainly the Hindus, will vote only for the BJP, or at least especially recently. And so what this has created is a great deal of suspicion all across the board that what the ruling party, the BJP, is in power both in Delhi and in Assam, it would benefit if you had a disqualification process that ended up disenfranchising Muslims. Now, this is just a sort of, it's becomes, this should be an issue which is discussed rationally and calmly. It should be an issue about how do you deal with the fact that millions of people have come into India. I think it's perfectly legitimate for any country to want to police its borders, but at the same time, you have to, any country in the world, right? But at the same time, you want to look at these people with a certain degree of humanity. On Mr. Pandit's point, it's certainly true that the demographics of the region have shifted in a particular way, where the non-Muslim minorities in places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, have declined precipitously, whereas the Muslim minority in India, its numbers have increased. But the fact remains that India was conceptualized as a secular country. Right. It was always seen as a secular country. And I think it's rather late in the day, and it's extremely contentious at this point to try to reimagine it as a Hindu republic, which will allow people in from some religions and not allow people from other religions in.
Rana, what do you make of what you're hearing here? Is this, at the end of the day, about politics? This is about parties going after votes.
Well, absolutely, Anand. Even when Sushil was trying to define the situation or trying to explain the situation, even he agreed and conceded that, Hindu migrants should be accepted because, they have been victimized. There's been a genocide of Hindus. So you have even the spokespersons of the BJP and those who almost speak for the BJP will concede that they have made it more of a communal issue. Even when it came to the Rohingyas issue, for that matter, when India was asked to take the Rohingya migrants from Bangladesh and from Myanmar, I mean, this government stance and the kind of language that the government spokespersons used, for instance, that the Rohingyas ate human lives and ate human beings, and that India should not be taking the Rohingyas because they are prospective terrorists. Even the language that you see that the BJP has used in terms of migrants, that they are prospective terrorists and they could possibly it's a national security issue. That is something that you only raise vis-a-vis Muslim migrants. Of course, you are trying to say this because you're going to, we are on our way to the 2019 general elections. The president of the ruling party has said that should the Assam model be successful, they would like to implement this in other states of India. This is not a migrant issue. This is also an issue wherein you are trying to tell your vote bank that we are going to cater to you, the Hindu majority. In 2014, when Mr. Modi was going to assume power during his pre-election speeches, he made it very clear that he's going to kick out the infiltrators from Bangladesh who are coming to India. And he has repeated this rhetoric time and again, every time before elections. In Assam, of course, the BJP has now assumed power, and it would like to disenfranchise the Muslim voters to make sure that it wins the state and also sends out a signal to the majority population in India that we cater to you and not to the Muslims. Right. So it has become more of an election issue rather than a humanitarian issue. This is a humanitarian crisis. This is one of the biggest disenfranchisement exercises in India. So we have made it a political issue out of a humanitarian crisis.
Right. Sushil, the question right now is what happens to the people on this list, 4 million people right now. The government is not acting to deport these people. In fact, India's Home Minister has said that we have to go through the process. They will be allowed further appeals. They will be allowed to submit the necessary paperwork to show that they were in India before 1971. But what happens, because at this stage we have people, families that have been separated, we have people put in detention camps. What's next?
You see, there's a system in place. No system in India is arbitrary or beyond the reach of courts to adjudicate. We are a functioning democracy. We haven't had such a situation in the past where millions of aliens had to be dealt with. So this is a new situation, and I'm sure our system will rise to the fact. The point is, would you allow your country to be inundated by aliens of whichever faith in the name of a humanitarian crisis? You have several countries in Europe, in East Europe, who are today asking for reversal of refugees. Demography is destiny. How many times do I have to say this, to repeat it, to let people make some sense of it? It is going to destabilize societies, unleash a different kind of violence, and are we going to allow ourselves to be inundated with this kind of violence? It is unfair of people to expect India to soak in millions and millions of alien immigrants, especially those who are not running away from persecution, but who are entering for the sake of economic opportunity.
All right.
And you cannot equate those who are facing religious persecution with those who are coming for economic opportunity.
All right.
Anywhere in the world, any sovereign country would protect its borders.
Okay, let me get your view on that, Sadanand, the fact that, as Sushil points out, countries are being inundated.
I mean, I think in many ways Sushil is fighting an old battle. His arguments are old. If you look at Bangladesh today, if you look at Bangladesh's birth rates and if you look at its per capita income, this is not a country that is pumping millions and millions of migrants into India. That is just factually incorrect. It is certainly true that millions of migrants did come to India, many of them 5 decades ago. And that they did change the demographic balance of Assam, and I think it's legitimate for the people of Assam to want some kind of reckoning with that. But the notion that India is being inundated with, by millions of Muslim migrants from outside its borders is just factually incorrect.
So, Suchitra, what legal recourse do the people have in Assam, the 4 million people on this list right now? Do they, I mean, in many instances, the people there are illiterate, they're not educated, they do not know how to get out of the situation they're in.
Right. This might be a cliche, but what you really see is a Kafkaesque nightmare. First, to start with, the people who have now been excluded have not been given reasons as to why they've been excluded. So even to find out why they're excluded, they would have to go in and file a petition. Second, again, we talk about procedure. What these people have is no more than a month to petition and submit their papers. A month, you have 21 working days. So you have 4 million people who are going to be reaching out to all these different centers to file petitions, find out what's happening, and that time is not going to work. The second thing is that in this case, in Assam, there's already plans to build a large detention center. And what people are worrying is that while deportations in modern democracies, deporting 4 million people is not a unilateral act. You genuinely need cooperation of another nation state. What we've seen is that Prime Minister Modi was in Bangladesh in 2015, and yet during these conversations, there were no negotiations about repatriation, returning of citizens. What they always speak about is smuggling and other issues, but never the question of what happens. So what many people, including local activists, worry is that majority of these people might be put into detention centers. I was there for about 2 months earlier this year, and what you saw in these detention centers, prisons that have been turned into detention centers, is that many legal citizens who have voted in elections have been wrongly picked up and held. Currently, you have Rashminara Begum, who was a pregnant woman whose father was a freedom fighter who was held in this detention center. Again, she didn't have the right papers, mostly because she turned away, she moved. What you really see is that the due process is not working. And again, the question is that we do not know what the answers are. And a month is not a good enough time for 4 million people to find out as to why they have been excluded and then go ahead and give these documents or file these documents.
Sushil, what we are seeing here is not very new, is it? I mean, if we look at what happened in India after independence, when the subcontinent was divided, when it was partitioned, we had a mass movement of people from both sides of the border. People were expelled from both sides of the border. We had it with Hindus being expelled from Kashmir. Are you familiar with that kind of thing? Does it just continue, or does the government have to come to some kind of solution on the fact that people will be moving all the time in that part of the world?
No, it is about time, because a lot of bordering districts of India are facing this pressure of incessant infiltration. What Sadanand just said, that this is old hat, let me point out to him that Indian embassy in Dhaka has the singular distinction of issuing more visas than any embassy anywhere else in the world. 10,000 visas a day plus. Now that is the level of a movement of Bangladeshis legitimately into India. What to think of the porous borders? And within India, you see natives fleeing for secure, safer pastures. You see Barpeta, you see Goalpara in Assam, you see Nagaon and Dhubri completely inundated. You see Murshidabad and Malda, you see Kishanganj, Purnia, Araria, Khagadia. These are bordering districts of Bangladesh in Bihar, Bengal and Assam. Right. There is a huge demographic destabilization of the natives, and this is not going to be peaceful if any government turns a blind eye and does nothing about it.
Sadanand, are we seeing major destabilization of natives?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is, I mean, the language used is so charged. 100 years ago, all these people were Indian. Yeah. Right? The notion that some people are natives, it's fair to say that because of partition, lines were drawn, and that has consequences. But using this charged language, like calling one group of people natives and other people not natives, many Muslims are as native as anybody. You can be Muslim and Indian, and it doesn't make you any less Indian. Right. You can be Bengali and Muslim and Indian. You are a native. You can be Assamese and Muslim and Indian. That you are a native. So this notion that anyone who happens to be Muslim is not native, I think is extremely problematic.
This is disingenuous. A Bengali in Assam is not a native, especially in Goalpara, in Barpeta, where I'm talking about. These are Assamese-speaking lands. Yes, a Bengali in Kachhar, in Silchar, is native, but again, not from Chittagong hill tracts. You see expulsion of Chakma tribals from there. It's a mess. You cannot have just simplistic takes on this issue.
Sadanand, how do you see this unfold in the months and the years ahead? Do you see some kind of process where perhaps the Indian Parliament passes legislation to normalize the situation?
Well, first of all, I do not think that some of the direst predictions are going to come true. Right. I don't think there's going to be any kind of mass deportation for the simple reason that the Bangladeshis are not interested in that, and sensible people in India recognize that if people have been there for 40, 45, 50 years, you have to find some way to allow them to continue with their lives. So deportation is not an issue. Perhaps there will be some kind of adjustment to the voter lists. I think that's what the main thing is. And I think that this is going to remain something that is on the boil at least until the 2019 elections. Only after the 2019 elections, I think, are we going to see some greater clarity prevail.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.